This is the first passage in the reading section, so let's read the blurb. The passage is adapted from Willer Cather O Pioneers, originally published in 1913. John Bergson is a farmer on his deathbed. Alexandra Bergson is his teenage daughter. The first paragraph establishes his relationship to the land. It says, in 11 long years, that's how long he's been there, John Bergson had made but little impression upon the wild land that he had come to tame. In this case, but means only. So it sounds basically like he was not the greatest farmer, or he didn't have very much success with the land. And then they actually say that he was probably literally in his bed. The sick man was feeling this as he lay looking out of the window after the doctor had left him. And we also know his daughter had just recently arrived, because it says, on the day following Alexandra's trip to town. And the rest of the paragraph talks about how he knows his land very well, which makes sense if he's been there for 11 years. The next paragraph continues this discussion about him and the land, going a little bit into his thoughts. It says, he had the old world belief that land in itself is desirable, but this land was an enigma, and it talks about how it was probably difficult to figure out. He said he had an idea that no one understood how to farm it properly, and he often discussed this with Alexandra, his daughter. Then it mentions their neighbors, who apparently knew less about farming than he did. And probably the reason is, if you look at their background, it said they had been hand workers at home, tailors, locksmiths, joiners, cigar makers, until they took up their homesteads. So this gives you a general sense of why he is probably out there with his daughter, and all these people, they kind of moved out west on these homesteads, and they were trying to make a living, but it seemed to be very difficult. So starting in the next paragraph from line 26, it continues exploring John's thoughts. So it said in line 30, he looked up at the roof beams that he made himself, he looked at his cattle, and then we move into a little bit of a discussion about his daughter. So it says he often called his daughter in to talk to her about this, specifically the weight of the steers. So the picture we get of her is that she's very smart. It says, before Alexandra was 12 years old, she had begun to be a help to him, and as she grew older, he'd come to depend on her more and more upon her resourcefulness and her good judgment. And then it's kind of funny, they compare her to his boys. It says his boys, his sons, were willing enough to work, but when he talked with them, they usually irritated him for whatever reason. On the other hand, it was Alexandra who read the papers, followed the markets, learned the mistakes of their neighbors. It was Alexandra who could always tell what it had cost to fatten each steer. She basically knows the details about how to manage the animals. Lou and Oscar, apparently those are the names of his sons, were industrious, meaning they were hardworking, but he could never teach them to use their heads about work. Starting in line 49 to 50, we are introduced to a new character, which is Alexandra's grandfather, or presumably John Bergson's father. It says that he had been a shipbuilder, a man of considerable force and some fortune. Then it talks about how he married a woman of questionable character, and it says in a few years, his unprincipled wife warped the probity of a lifetime. What happened? It says he speculated, lost his own fortune and funds entrusted him by poor seafaring men, and he died disgraced, leaving his children with nothing. But on the other hand, when all was said and done, he had come up from the sea himself, built up a proud little business with no capital but his own skill and foresight, and proved himself to be a man. This is really serving to be a comparison to his daughter, because line 66, it says, in his daughter, John Bergson recognized the strength of will, the simple, direct way of thinking things out that had characterized his father. His daughter and his father he's viewing very similarly. And then in the last part of the paragraph, it talks about, him thinking about what's going to happen after he dies. Line 69, he would much rather, of course, have seen this likeness, meaning these characteristics, in one of his sons, but it was not a question of choice. He had to accept the situation as it was, and to be thankful that there was one among his children, the daughter, whom he can entrust the future of his family and the possibilities of his hard-won land. So if we're going to mark up the passage just real quick, we can say the beginning introduces the land, and then we're talking about him being sick. We talk more about the difficulty of the land in paragraph 2. Then starting in line 35 is the discussion about his daughter and also his sons in comparison. Starting in line 50, talks about his grandfather. And then line 67 really goes back to his daughter, and he's also thinking about the future. All right, question 1. A central theme developed in the passage is that of the... All right, so keep in mind, we're talking about this guy, John Bergson. He came on this land. The land hasn't been treating him very well. His daughter is smarter than his sons and has been helping him out. And then he reflects on his grandfather and talks about how his grandfather is hardworking just like his daughter. Choice A, the danger of exploiting the environment for material gain. So you don't really get a sense that the passage is saying that there's a danger in the fact that these, homesteaders were out there trying to farm the land and everything. It's also not entirely clear that their main motive was material gain. So A doesn't really seem to be right. Choice B, dependability of family despite past conflict among members. Not really a sense of past conflict amongst the members. All it really says was his sons irritated him for whatever reason. So not likely going to be choice B. It does talk about his daughter being very dependable, but it's not despite past conflict with her. Choice C, foolishness of denying the inevitability of old age. Doesn't really seem like the main character, John Bergson, is denying his old age. The only part that would suggest that is when they talked about his grandfather. So let's take a look at that real quick. So if you look at line 56, it says, on the shipbuilder's part, again, this is his own father, this marriage was an infatuation, the despairing folly of a powerful man who cannot bear to grow old. So that's probably why he made a poor choice in terms of which woman to marry. But again, that was his grandfather and not so much the main character. So C doesn't really seem to summarize a central theme of the passage. Choice D, futility of seeking to gain full mastery over the natural world. Choice D, it does seem like the best choice compared to A, B, and C. I'm not sure how much I really like it. What parts of the passage could go along with the idea of gaining mastery over the natural world? You could argue, for one, that the fact that this guy's on his deathbed, so we don't really have mastery over our own health. Certainly all the discussion about the land and the fact that they could not farm it. And then also, if you look back in the passage, it talked a lot about how he had wished that his sons were the people that he could pass on his land to, but it actually turned out to be his daughter. So that's another area that he could not gain mastery over. In other words, he couldn't really decide who out of his kids were going to be the smartest and the ones most capable of taking over the business. And if you're curious, that was in line 69. He would much rather, of course, seen this likeness, meaning the hardworkingness, in one of his sons, but it was not a question of choice. So you don't get to choose which one of your kids are going to be smart and which ones not so much. Question 2. Over the course of the passage, the main focus of John Bergson's thoughts shift from... All right, so before you look at the answer choices, just kind of check your annotations and, remind yourself on how the passage moves. Remember that initially we started talking about the land, and then he starts talking about his daughter, and then a little bit about his sons, and then his grandfather or his own father, back to his daughter again. Keeping that in mind, let's read through the choices. Choice A, weaknesses that he deplores in his sons to the strengths that he prizes in his daughter. He does talk about things that he doesn't like in terms of his sons, but it's really only in 2 places. So let's take a look at it. So it says, number 1, in line 40, his boys were willing to work, but when he talked with them, they usually irritated him. And then in line 47, like we said, Lou and Oscar were industrious, but he can never teach them to use their heads about their work. So hardworking, but not the brightest. Regardless, though, that's not enough of a focus of the passage to make A a good answer, so we'll cross it out. Choice B, initial difficulty that he faced as a novice farmer to his eventual achievement as an experienced farmer. So it is true that he got more experience in the 11 years that he was there, but it doesn't seem like he ever got to a point where he achieved much success or became very good at his job. So B, not likely. Choice C, challenges of being a successful farmer to those of being a successful shipbuilder. Again, the shipbuilder was his father, but really the focus of the passage was not so much how to be a successful farmer and then how to be a successful shipbuilder. He mentions his father because he's talking about the way that his father is similar to his daughter. So C, not likely. D, physical qualities of his land to the personal qualities that he values most in a potential successor. D does seem to be the closest to what we're looking for, because if you remember, he does talk about the land, and then he talks about characteristics that his daughter has, and then characteristics that his father has, and then it shifts at the very end to him thinking about who's going to be a good successor. So choice D is the best one. Particularly if you look towards the last 4 lines, it says, he had to accept the situation as it was and be thankful that there was one amongst his children whom he could entrust the future of his family and the possibilities of his hard-won land. So that's definitely a theme, or why he's thinking about that, because again, he is on his deathbed. Question 3. The simile in lines 14 to 17 primarily serves which function? All right, so they're asking, what is the purpose of that simile? Why is it there? So let's look at 14 to 17. By the way, this is a question that you want to leave until the end, because unless you are supremely confident of the answer, you're going to have to check probably most of the answer choices or all of them. So that takes a lot of time. Just skip it for now and come back to it if you're making good time on the first passage. All right, let's read it. It says 14, John Bergson had the old world belief that land in itself is desirable, but this land was an enigma. It was like a horse that no one knows how to break to harness, that runs wild and kicks things to pieces. All right, so that's actually the simile. They're comparing the land to the horse. What's the purpose? They're trying to illustrate the fact that he did not have very much success with probably farming the land or whatever he wanted to do it. He had an idea that no one understood how to farm it properly and blah, blah, blah. Just keep that in mind, that the land is basically hard to work with. So let's look at choice A. It expands on the characterization provided in lines 3 to 5. So let's read it. Line 3, it says, it was still a wild thing, the land, that had its ugly moods, and no one knew when they were likely to come or why. So yeah, we are talking about the land here, and that does kind of expand upon it. So A does seem like an okay answer so far. We'll keep it for now. B, it contrasts with the images evoked in lines 5 to 6. Line 5, it says, mischance hung over it. Its genius was unfriendly to man. This kind of actually goes along with the idea that the land is hard to work with, so not really a contrast. So we'll cross off B because it's not a contrast. Choice C, it highlights the belief conveyed in 14 to 15. 14 to 15, it says, John Bergson had the old world belief that land is desirable. Talking about the horse being difficult to break and the land being difficult to farm, does it highlight this belief that the land is desirable? It actually contrasts this, and it's a contrast in thought because it says, but this land is an enigma. In other words, he thought it was desirable initially, but the reality was much harsher. So definitely not highlighting the belief, it actually contrasts with it, so C is out. Choice D, reinforces the details presented in 22 to 25. 22 to 25, it says, they had been hand workers at home, tailors, locksmiths, joiners, cigar makers. Bergson himself had worked in a shipyard. These are the details about the people who came to the homesteads, what they did before. Comparing the land to a horse doesn't reinforce the idea that these people came from different professions and had nothing to do with farming. The simile is talking about the land itself. So choice D, not going to work, and we will cross it out and stick with A. Question 4, in the passage, the main contrast that John Bergson draws between himself and his neighbors is that, so you should recall that he said his neighbors were also having problems with the land. Specifically, let's look at the 2 places where he mentions the neighbors. One is in line 20. Their neighbors certainly knew less about farming than he did. Many of them had never even worked on a farm. They had been herd workers, tailors, locksmiths. Bergson himself had worked in a shipyard. And the second place that it mentions the neighbors was starting in line 41. It was Alexandra who read the papers, followed the markets, who learned the mistakes of their neighbors. Apparently they were doing a little bit better than the neighbors were. Choice A, they had previously worked in urban areas while he had always worked in rural areas. So definitely not from that list of occupations that were listed, and he was in a shipyard, so probably not in a rural area. So A is going to be out on both those counts. B, less skilled than he is at the occupation that they all have in common. That would be farming. So that does seem to work because it seems that his daughter helped him out a lot more, or helped him out, and that made him a little bit better than his neighbors. C, resisted becoming homestead farmers, whereas he was eager to become one. Again, no indication that they resisted versus him being eager, just really no talk about how willing any of them were to do that. Choice D, had better luck with their particular parcels of land than he did with his. Actually, the opposite. They probably had worse luck than he did because they were doing worse than him. So all that means choice B is going to be the best answer. Question 5, as used in line 42, followed most nearly means. So let's take a look at it. So remember, for these, you always want to try to guess your own word before you look at the answer choices. Line 41, it was Alexandra who read the papers and followed the markets, and who learned by the mistakes of their neighbors. We're just talking about how she's kind of resourceful and knowledgeable, and there's kind of a parallelism going here. She read the papers, followed the markets. If we were to guess our own word for followed, you can say something like she paid attention to, or she kept up with, or she was knowledgeable about the markets, any one of those. So let's take a look at what they say. Choice A, came after the markets. That doesn't make any sense. Imitated closely the markets. It doesn't really make sense to say that she imitated the markets closely. C, kept under guard. Nothing about the markets that you'd have to keep under guard, like a dog or something. Choice D, stayed informed about. This one does seem to be the closest to our guess words. She followed the markets, meaning to say she stayed informed about them. And so we'll go with choice D. Question 6, the narrator most clearly indicates that John regards his sons as. So this is something we talked about already, but let's remind ourselves real quick. He talks about his sons in 2 places. Line 39, his boys were willing enough to work, but when he talked with them, they usually irritated him. And then line 47, Lou and Oscar were industrious, but he can never teach them to use their heads. So both lines emphasize the fact that they are hardworking, but for some reason they irritated him, possibly because he can never teach them to use their heads about their work. It implies that they're less than intelligent or not really thinking, and certainly not as smart as the daughter. So let's go to the answer choices. A, hardworking but not smart enough to manage the farm. Certainly seems like it's the right answer. We'll keep it. B, loyal but insufficiently appreciative of the farm's value. No mention of how well they understood the value of the farm. Loyal maybe, but because of that part, B is out. C, well-intentioned but too reckless to handle the family's business. Well-intentioned, maybe you could argue that, but being too reckless, not really justified by the passage. Again, talking about them not using their heads. In what way? We're not 100% sure, but A seems to be better than C, so we'll cross it off. D, capable but unwilling to involve their sister in overseeing the farm. Again, no mention about what their attitude was towards their sister's role in overseeing the farm. So D, not going to be the answer, and we'll go with A. The questions 7 and 8 should be done together. I just usually draw an arrow to remind myself of that. It says the passage best supports which characterization, so which description of Alexandra Berkson in her attention to the details of the family farm. In general, the impression that we get of her is something very good. Let's quickly look through the answer choices and maybe we can settle on one before we go to 8. Choice A, she values others' opinions and ideas. Possibly because it did say that she followed trends and she probably did a lot of research. We'll keep it around. Choice B, she possesses great instinct and insight. Yeah, that definitely sounds like it might be the answer. B is more likely than A for now. C, she reluctantly defers to her brother's decisions. No mention of that whatsoever. D, she is a better farmer than was her father as a young man. Didn't say anything about the father being a farmer when he was young. He was actually working with ships. D, also not going to work. Likely it's going to be choice B. So let's go to question 8. Which choice provides the best evidence for the answer to the previous question? So now we actually have to look back at the passage. And so we're looking for something that generally shows her in a positive light, either valuing other people's opinions and ideas or possessing great instinct and insight. Choice A, 31 to 35. 31, it says, he counted the cattle over and over, diverted him to speculate as to how much weight each of the steers would probably put on by spring. He often called his daughter in to talk to her about this. It does kind of support the idea that he relies on her, but there's probably going to be a better choice because this is kind of indirect. A, not going to be likely, but we'll keep it around. Choice B, 39 to 41. His boys were willing enough to work, but when he talked to them, with them, they usually irritated him. So this is about more his boys, not Alexandra, so probably not going to be the answer. Cross off choice B. C, 41 to 47. It was Alexandra who read the papers and followed the markets and who learned by the mistakes of their neighbors. It was Alexandra who could always tell about what it had cost to fatten each steer and who could guess the weight of a hog before it went on the scales, closer than John Bergson himself. This is all evidence, more likely that she pays attention to detail as opposed to, weighs the opinions of others. So right now, if we look back at the answer choices, it does seem like the best match is going to be choice C with choice B. But let's check choice D just to make sure. Line 49 to 51. Alexandra, her father often said to himself, was like her grandfather, which was his way of saying that she was intelligent. Does the fact that she was like her grandfather and smart support either choice A or choice B? Maybe choice B, but certainly not as well as choice C in question 8 does. So we'll cross off D and we'll go with C for question 8 and B for question 7. Question 9. Which choice most clearly supports the idea that John Bergson's father was afraid of aging? So likely the answer is going to have something to do with him marrying that younger woman that we already talked about, but we do have to go through the choices. Choice A, 51 to 53. John Bergson's father had been a shipbuilder, a man of considerable force and some fortune. Again, nothing about fear of aging, so A is not going to be the answer. We'll cross it off. Choice B, 53 to 56. And notice, actually, when you look at the answer choices, they kind of all proceed. It's sort of like the next sentence, the next sentence, the next sentence. So let's just read all the way to 59 and decide which sentence actually is most in support of him being afraid of aging. 53, it says, late in his life, he married a second time a Stockholm woman of questionable character, much younger than he, who goaded him into every sort of extravagance. So here we do mention the fact that he is marrying a woman of questionable character. Not so much direct evidence that he's in fear of aging, though, not yet. So let's read the next sentence. This is going to be choice C. On the shipbuilder's part, this marriage was an infatuation, the despairing folly of a powerful man who cannot bear to grow old. So it does seem that this sentence right here is going to back it up the most. And then choice D, 58 to 59. In a few years, his unprincipled wife warped the probity of a lifetime. Problems with his wife, but nothing in that particular sentence that talks about his fear of growing old. And so choice C is going to be the answer, because when it says cannot bear to grow old, that's the evidence that we're looking for. Question 10. Which situation is most similar to that described in lines 66 to 75? In his daughter, John Bergson recognized the strength of will and the simple, direct way of thinking things out that had characterized his father in his better days. He would much rather, of course, have seen this likeness in one of his sons, but it was not a question of choice. As he lay there, he had to accept the situation as it was and to be thankful there was one amongst his children to whom he could entrust the future of his family and the possibilities of his hard-won land. All right, to summarize, he's basically saying his daughter is like his father. Just because she's smart, she's capable, he would much rather have it have been his son, but he can't do that, and he has to accept the reality for what it is, and that has to do with entrusting the future of his family and his hard-won land. All right, so let's read through the choices and see which one is the most similar to that. Choice A. A teacher sees her female students outperforming her male students, and she chastises the males for not working harder. It does have the male-female comparison. It doesn't really have the expectation that she wanted her male students to do better, and there's nothing about chastising, criticizing them for not working harder in the original. So A, probably not the answer. Choice B. A small business owner is faced with daunting new challenges, but her employees collaborate successfully to solve the problems. B doesn't really have anything to do with the analogy. Keep in mind it's him wanting his son to be the capable one, but it's actually the daughter. Choice C. A coach needs one of her players to step forward and lead the team, but that player who does so is not the one the coach expected. This answer does seem to work. This idea here that the person who steps forward to lead the team is not who the coach expected. In the same sense, John Bergson expected his son to take over the estate, but the one who stepped up is his daughter, not who she suspected. So if it's a choice between A and C, C seems to work better. Choice D. A shopkeeper works hard to ensure that her daughter will have better opportunities than she had, and the daughter eventually runs a large corporation. What does this have in common with the original? It is a daughter, and the daughter is eventually going to be successful, but nothing here about the shopkeeper's own expectations, nothing here about the shopkeeper sort of having the daughter take over the business. C is probably going to be the best choice.